Hey folks, I'm just going to record the Module 6 lecture because we are going to run out of time. Due to the Veterans Day holiday, we are going to need some backup for covering all this material. So I'm going to do a video version of the lecture that you can refer to. Okay, so Module 6, Chapter 12 and Chapter 13. Chapter 12 is Social Psych. Chapter 13 is personality psychology and like research into the self. So we start with Chapter 12, Social Psychology, some of my favorite stuff. Oop, I'm just going to start my timer here. I try not to make these videos go any longer than 20 minutes a piece. So it's just kind of a more digestible bite size. Okay, so social psych, the study of how people influence others' behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes, right? So it's the view in psychology that says, hey, if I want to understand you, I need to understand you in context, right? Like you embedded in your life with all the relationships that you have with other people. So it's how we affect each other. So one of the things we talk about in social psych is how we think about other people, how we come to sort of conclusions about others, right? So one area of research talks about how we make snap judgments about other people. When we first meet somebody, we make a bunch of more or less automatic judgments about them. And some of these come from how we feel about a person's nonverbal behaviors, like how they're moving their body, their facial expressions. So some of that research comes from Ambati and Rosenthal back in 1993. They found that people can make accurate judgments based on only a few seconds of observation, what they called thin slices of behavior. So for example, in one study, participants viewed soundless 30-second clips of college teachers lecturing, and then they were asked to rate the professor's teaching ability. Okay, so they only saw this professor for 30 seconds without any sound on, and then they were asked to give a rating. And the ratings people gave agreed very strongly with the ratings that were given by the professor's actual students, who had more than 30 seconds and with the sound on. In another study, Rosenthal found that people who watched videotapes of judges' nonverbal actions could predict whether a jury would find the defendant guilty or not guilty, just by watching the judges' facial expressions, hearing their tone of voice, looking at their gestures. Another example might be gaydar. People are pretty good at judging sexual orientation based on nonverbal behaviors. It's certainly not perfect, but at greater than chance levels. Okay, so all of this suggesting that some of the decisions we make about other people happen very fast, automatically, and can be surprisingly accurate. We also make attributions about other people. So an attribution is a story you tell yourself about why something happened or why someone behaved a certain way. So we often assume that people who do something heroic or kind are in fact heroic, kind people, and that people who do something rude or hurtful are in fact rude, hurtful people, right? So we're assuming that behaviors that people engage in tell us about their character. But what social psychology says is, don't forget that the situation people are in can be a powerful predictor of behavior. So it's not always about somebody's character. Often it's about the situation we are in. So an attribution is an explanation we come up with for the causes of people's behavior, right? Including our own. So when Joe observes Bob hitting Steve here, how is Joe going to explain Bob's behavior? He will probably assume Bob is a scary bad guy, right? Because he's done this violent thing. But what he doesn't know is, what has Steve done? What's just happened here? What's the nature of their relationship? So there's an awful lot situationally that isn't clear. So you can divide up attributions into two big types. There's situational attributions and there's personal attributions. So a situational attribution is when we attribute behavior to external causes. That is, we see the reason for a behavior as being outside the person. For example, your uncle's hardware store goes out of business, and you attribute it to the new Walmart that went up on the corner. right? Uncle Joe's store went under. Why? Because he couldn't compete with the big box store that moved in not far away. Contrast that with a personal attribution where we attribute behavior to dispositional causes, meaning stuff inside the person, characteristics of the person. So your uncle's hardware store goes bankrupt and you attribute it to him not having a good head for business, right? Uncle Joe should have never tried to open a store. He just doesn't have what it takes. Okay, so we have the option of situational and personal attributions. We tend to make personal attributions, so we have kind of a preference for those because we like to believe that people get what they deserve. So this is known as the just world hypothesis, the idea that this is a just world, which means you get what you deserve, right? So even if the world is terribly, desperately unfair, we try to think about what's going on around us in such a way that it feels like it is fair. And so this often results in blaming victims for what has happened to them, right? So Uncle Joe going out of business and us blaming it on the fact that Uncle Joe's not good at business, right? Sort of, is a just world way of thinking that he got what he deserved, right? It's the same way that traditionally, victims of rape have been treated, right? Like she deserved it. What was she doing in those clothes at that place at that time? Like as if, she is to blame for the fact that somebody else assaulted her. So we have certain kind of biases in the way that we make attributions. When we explain other people's behaviors, we probably overemphasize personality traits and we underestimate the situation. So this pervasive tendency is called the fundamental attribution error. It's so kind of common that it's fundamental, a bias towards over-attributing the behavior of others to personal causes. Right? So, if you're cutting someone else off in traffic, you're going to make attributions about why you did it that are different than if somebody else cut you off in traffic, or you might see them as somehow being a bad person, right? Right? So someone cuts you off in traffic, you see their behavior as evidence that they're a bad person, they have bad character. But if it's me doing it, then I'm going to come up with a different explanation. So when we look at other people's behavior, we overestimate the role of personal influences. We underestimate the role of the situation. And we do the opposite for our own behavior, which is a tendency called the actor-observer bias, right? Everybody's stupid except me. So we witness somebody else behaving badly. Aha, that's evidence they're a bad person. But if it's you behaving badly, you tend not to conclude, oh, I'm a bad person. You attribute it to something else, like I'm having a bad day, I didn't get enough sleep last night, stuff like that, right? We have external reasons why we would be behaving badly. Okay, so some terms to make sure we get: thin slices, right, where we can make relatively accurate judgments about people with minimal kind of information. Studying facial expressions and eye contact. These are the ways that we make judgments about people. Different kinds of attributions, situational versus personal. The just world hypothesis, which is why we tend to blame people when bad things happen to them, because we want to believe people get what they deserve. The fundamental attribution error, where we overestimate the importance of dispositional factors in other people's behaviors. And the actor-observer bias, where, especially when people are behaving badly, we see that as evidence they're bad people. But when it's us behaving badly, we have an external attribution for that. Okay, we tend to stereotype other people, right? Stereotypes are mental shortcuts we've talked about before that allow us to quickly process social information, right? And it's pretty much an automatic thing that happens most of the time outside of our own awareness. In and of themselves, stereotypes are neutral. They're just schemas that reflect efficient cognitive processes, little mental shortcuts that we use. Once we form a stereotype, it tends to stick around. Why? Because we start to interpret people's behavior in ways to maintain the stereotype. Remember that we are cognitively lazy, right? So once we have categorized a person and made assumptions about a person, we don't want to have to change our minds. So we will reinterpret information coming in to be consistent with what we already believe. So this is confirmation bias again, which we talked about in the last module. So for example, if you hear somebody is two-faced, you might interpret your interactions with them based on that filter, right? Seeing everything they say and do now through the filter of they're deceptive people. So stereotypes can influence basic perceptual processes. They did a bunch of studies on this back in the early 2000s. So in the first one, white participants were briefly shown a picture of a white person's face or the face of a person of color. So, they'd be looking at a screen and an image would come and go really fast, so fast that participants weren't aware of having seen it. But after each face, a picture of either a tool, like a wrench or pliers, or a gun appears. And participants are asked to classify the object as a tool or a gun as quickly as possible. When they had just seen the face of a Black person, participants identified the gun more quickly and were more likely to mistake the tool for a gun than when they had just seen a white person's face. So think about, the spreading activation model and nodes. It speaks to this idea that for white people, a Black person's face, that node of sort of Blackness and the node of guns are closely connected. So a self-fulfilling prophecy is when people behave in ways that confirm other people's expectations. So Rosenthal and Jacobson did a series of studies in the 60s that demonstrate self-fulfilling prophecy. Just check my timer here. Okay. So in one study, elementary school students took a test that supposedly was able to identify those kids who are especially likely to show large increases in their IQ during that year. That is the idea that they were about to bloom or blossom intellectually. So kids took this test, and then the teachers, not the kids, the teachers were given a list identifying those students, right? So the teachers were given a list of their class roster with like certain students highlighted saying, these are the ones who are about to blossom. At the end of the year, those so-called bloomers had showed large increases in their IQs compared to the other students. In fact, though, those students had just been randomly selected from the list. The test really didn't measure anything. So their increases in IQ probably came from the extra attention and encouragement and the messages that the teachers were giving them about, them being capable and smart. So the teachers' expectations became the reality. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think the kid is smart, they might start to act smart. Then there's stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is the worry or the fear that some people might experience if they believe their performance on tests might confirm negative beliefs about their group. This can cause anxiety and distraction, which reduces short-term memory capacity, undermines confidence and motivation. So stereotype threat applies to any group that's subject to negative stereotypes. For example, women tend to do more poorly on men than men when taking an exam if they've been told that men typically outscore women. But they'll score just as well as the men on the same test if they haven't been told that. Okay, so if right before the test, the women are told, hey, ladies tend to score less well on this than guys, then they might score less well. So there's a lot of good evidence that being anxious about confirming stereotypes can interfere with performance. Right? If you're the only woman in an engineering program and you've received messages that women are less good than men at this stuff, then not only are you concerned that you might not do well, but your performance, right, is sort of a stand-in for women everywhere. So if you don't do well, then the message might be, see, women don't belong in engineering. See, girls suck at math. Okay, so that's stereotype threat. Okay. Stereotypes can also obviously lead to prejudice and discrimination. So let's make sure we know what those terms are. So prejudice involves prejudging something or someone negatively, arriving at unfavorable conclusions before evaluating the evidence, right? So prejudice is an attitude, okay, based on stereotyped thinking. Things like girls aren't as good at math as boys, right? Something like that. Discrimination, on the other hand, is behaviors. So this would be like an action where members of particular groups are treated differently because of their membership in that group. Right? Within nearly every culture, some groups are discriminated against because of prejudice. In the last 50 years, 60 years, social psychologists have been looking at the causes and consequences of prejudice and looking for ways to combat it. So we can talk about in-group versus out-group, right? In-group refers to any group that you belong to. So your family might be, one of your in-groups, your friend group. It can get bigger than that too, like, your school, your community, your city, your state, your country, right? These are groups that we see ourselves as belonging to, right? The Batman group versus the Spider-Man group, for example. And out groups are groups we don't belong to. So for the little Batman clique, Spider-Man is a member of an out group. Right? We see this in high school cliques all the time where, it's the goths versus the preppies versus the whatever the labels are, right? So according to social identity theory, your group memberships are an important part of how you view yourself, right? So all the different in-groups you see yourself as belonging to contribute to your sense of who you are. We also tend to believe that the group we are in is better than a group we are not in. So this is known as in-group favoritism, the idea that my people are better than those people. We also tend to view out-group members as all the same. Okay? We're far more likely to do favors for in-group members than out-group members. So why are we so ready to form us versus them groups in our minds? One idea is that we evolved this tendency because throughout our history as a species, group survival has been essential for individual survival. Keeping resources for your group and denying them to the out group can confer an adaptive advantage to your group, right? Especially when resources are scarce. So if you can hoard the food and the water and the resources for your people, not only are you giving your people a leg up, but you are disadvantaging the out group, right? So some terms to make sure we know: stereotype, self-fulfilling prophecy, stereotype threat, prejudice and discrimination, in-group, out-group bias, social identity theory, in-group favoritism. So one technique for reducing prejudice and discrimination is really pretty simple: perspective taking, where you get people to think about other people's psychological realities, right? Thinking about what other people believe and how they feel can reduce bias. Walking a mile in their shoes. So for example, they've done research where, they found that taking the perspective of a transgender person markedly reduced prejudice towards transgender people in a sample of voters in Florida, an effect that persisted 3 months down the road, right? So just the exercise of imagine you were trans. What are you worrying about? What are the obstacles in your life? What are the challenges? What are the hopes? Right? Just running that exercise for a few minutes makes people less prejudiced towards trans people. And it seems to be a relatively lasting effect. Even just imagining having a positive social interaction with someone from an out group can reduce prejudice and increase pro-social behaviors towards them. So even just imagining talking to someone who isn't in your in-group can help you feel more tolerant towards that out-group. Okay. I'm going to pause there and we will pick this up in the next one.